Inside the Frosty Freeze, Clara was ringing up a young couple, their faces flushed with new love. 2 milk teas, 2 burgers, 1 order of fries, that's $58. The chime of the register sang out, and she smiled. Have a nice day. Suddenly, a light tap on her shoulder. She turned to see her friend, Maya, a curious grin playing on her lips. Clara, is it true? You're getting married? Clara faltered, then nodded with a smile. Yes. You're a stealth operator. I'm with you all the time, and I didn't even know you had a boyfriend. Maya exclaimed. Clara chuckled. It wasn't just Maya who didn't know. She barely knew. A week ago, a call from home had summoned her back. Fearing her grandfather, George, was ill, she'd rushed back. 2 strangers greeted her at the door, one radiating an aristocratic aura, the other strikingly handsome. Mr. Sterling, this is the young Miss Evelyn, now known as Clara Ray. George's voice broke the silence, pulling her back to the present. Miss Evelyn? Her gaze fell upon the man addressed as Mr. Sterling. His eyes, deep and serious, held hers. Clara looked away, her voice trembling. Grandpa, what's going on? Clara, I'm not your biological grandfather. George's voice was heavy. Your real name is Evelyn, heiress to the Evelyn fortune of Crestwood. Mr. Sterling, he's your fiancé. Clara stared, incredulous. Grandpa, is this some kind of joke? No, child. George's voice was filled with sorrow. I was the Evelyn family's butler. Your parents died in an accident, the company went bankrupt, and you were all that remained. I took you from Crestwood, and we started a new life here. The news struck Clara like a thunderbolt. She barely registered the conversation between George and Adrian Sterling, only Adrian's deep voice resonated in her mind. Miss Evelyn, I will marry you in 1 month. Another bomb. Earth to Clara. Maya waved a hand in front of her face. Huh? What? Clara blinked, dazed. I wasn't even talking. What's with the daydreaming? Maya's eyes widened with curiosity. Didn't sleep well, Clara mumbled. Pre-wedding jitters? Maya teased. Go on with you. Clara playfully shoved her. Humph. Maya walked away, only to gasp moments later. Oh my God. No way. What is it, drama queen? Clara sighed, turning to her easily excitable friend. Clara, look. He's gay. Maya shrieked. Who is? Clara followed Maya's gaze to the television screen, where an entertainment news story was playing. Yesterday, reporter you posted photos of Adrian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Zenith, with another man, leaving a hotel late at night. Their intimate behavior suggests a more than friendly relationship. The camera zoomed in on Adrian's profile. Clara's left hand clenched into a fist, anxiety knotting her stomach. Ugh, I can't even. I'm so over him. Maya grabbed the remote and started flipping channels. You had a crush on him? Clara asked, her mind reeling back to the present. Duh, he's a famous designer. His clothes are amazing. He retired from the public eye 3 years ago after taking over the family business, Maya said, a tinge of regret in her voice. You like fashion design? Clara probed. Love it. If my family wasn't struggling, I'd be doing it myself. A wistful expression crossed Maya's face. You're young. There's still time, Clara offered softly. Hopefully, Maya shrugged. 2 customers walked in, and Maya immediately greeted them. Clara turned back to the TV. A melancholic song played, and she drifted into thought. On her supposed wedding day, Adrian Sterling stood before a mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie. The door opened, and Henry Carter, his assistant, appeared, a hint of tension in his voice. Mr. Sterling, Miss Ray is gone. Adrian's hand froze. He slowly turned, his gaze piercing Henry. The men sent to retrieve her are at Mr. Ray's house. They've searched everywhere she might have gone, but there's no sign of her, Henry reported. Adrian frowned, then a cold smile played on his lips. Find a replacement. Henry stared, dumbfounded. Go, Adrian snapped. Yes, sir. Right away, Henry bowed his head and hurried out. 3 years later, Clara returned, transformed. As she stepped into her old apartment building, the neighbor's door opened. A middle-aged man, Walter, emerged, his eyes lighting up. Well, if it isn't little Clara Ray. Clara eyed him warily, giving a curt nod as she fumbled with her keys. She knew Walter. A gambling addict, abandoned by his wife, he had a terrible reputation. Your grandpa's gone, Clara, Walter said, his tone somber. What? Disbelief flooded Clara's eyes. The day you ran, they came, searched the whole building, couldn't find you. Took your grandpa instead. Walter leaned against the doorframe, his voice flat. Clara stumbled inside, her voice echoing through the empty apartment. Grandpa? Grandpa, I'm home. He's not here, Clara. Walter followed her in. Get out. Clara shouted, her voice thick with anger. Now, I'm practically family. Don't you miss old Uncle Walter? A lecherous grin spread across his face as he advanced. Get out. Clara's eyes blazed. Such a spitfire. Let Uncle Walter give you a hug. Walter lunged. Clara's face paled. She scrambled for the door, but Walter grabbed her arm, threw her onto the couch, and pinned her down. Get off me, you bastard! Clara screamed. Walter held her down, his face inches from hers. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the doorway, Walter. Where's my money? Walter froze, turning to see a large man, Joe, standing in the doorway. Joe. A day later, Joe took Clara away. Blindfolded, she was led through a maze of corridors, then shoved roughly. The blindfold was ripped off. Joe says you work here until you pay off Walter's debt. A woman in a stylish dress, a cigarette dangling from her lips, looked Clara up and down. I have nothing to do with Walter. Why should I pay his debts? Clara retorted. Honey, be smart. Earn the money, you leave. Otherwise, that pretty face will be messed up. The woman exhaled a plume of smoke. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. The woman nodded, satisfied. Someone, get her changed. Clara was dragged into a dressing room and shoved back out moments later, clad in a schoolgirl uniform. Understanding dawned, cold and sickening. Move it, we got customers waiting. A gruff voice propelled her forward, following another woman into a private room. A whirlwind of emotions churned inside her, too complex to name. Inside, several men sat waiting. As they entered, all eyes turned to them. Clara hesitantly lifted her gaze. Her face froze. Sitting in the center was Adrian Sterling. His eyes narrowed, predatory, locked onto her. Beside him, Henry Carter shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. He glanced at Adrian, his brow furrowed. This did not bode well for Miss Ray. One of the men, noticing Adrian's focus, barked, the last one, the schoolgirl, next to Mr. Sterling. Clara instinctively recoiled, but the woman beside her shoved her forward. What are you waiting for? Go. You'll be rewarded. The man scowled. Clara bit her lip and walked towards the couch, sitting stiffly beside Adrian. He picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid with a practiced ease. His voice, smooth and magnetic, cut through the silence. What's your name? Hesitantly, Clara replied, Lily. The name the woman had given her. Do you drink? He asked softly. No, Clara shook her head. A flicker of something unreadable flashed in Adrian's eyes. He took a sip of his drink. Clara sat beside him, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes, waiting for his reaction. Madam, Mr. Sterling is home. Clara sat up on the sofa, turning to see Adrian enter, impeccably dressed. She stood nervously. You're back. Yes. He loosened his tie and walked over to the sofa, sitting down. A month ago, Adrian had pulled her out of that club. She remembered his words clearly. When did my wife become a hostess? He'd addressed the madam with a chillingly polite smile. Then, turning to Clara, his voice had deepened. Come home with me. It had been like waking from a nightmare. Gratitude and something else had swelled inside her as she followed him out. Change. We're going to the estate. Adrian's voice broke into her thoughts. Oh. Clara looked up. His brow was furrowed, impatience flickering across his features. Right away. She hurried upstairs. In the bedroom, she selected a modest dress and quickly changed. Satisfied, she descended the stairs and joined Adrian. The car swept through the gates of the Sterling estate. A uniformed attendant opened the car door. Clara gasped, stunned by the opulence. The 3-story mansion glittered like a jewel, a miniature palace. The sprawling gardens were fit for royalty. Adrian, you've returned. A deep voice echoed from within. Grandfather. Adrian's voice was respectful. Mr. Sterling Sr. grunted, his sharp gaze sweeping over Clara, who involuntarily took a step back behind Adrian. Is this Harlan Evelyn's granddaughter? His voice boomed. Yes. Come upstairs with me. Mr. Sterling Sr. leaned heavily on his cane and started up the stairs. Adrian hesitated, glancing at Clara. Go, she whispered. After they left, Clara sat on the sofa, a maid bringing her a plate of fruit. Madam, please have some fruit. Thank you. Clara smiled and peeled an orange. Suddenly, a roar from upstairs shattered the tranquility. Clara nearly choked on her orange, patting her chest as she forced it down. George Ray forced you to marry Harlan Evelyn's granddaughter? Hearing George's name, Clara froze. What secrets lay between her grandfather and the Sterlings? She cautiously made her way upstairs, drawn by an irresistible urge to know more. She swore she wasn't eavesdropping, but anything concerning George was her business. He's the only one alive who knows what happened to my parents. Adrian's voice, low and intense, reached her. Where is he? Clara's heart pounded. She rushed to the door, but it swung open, sending her tumbling into the room. Both Adrian and Mr. Sterling Sr. stared at her. Clara scrambled to her feet, forcing a smile. Grandpa. No manners. Mr. Sterling Sr.'s cane slammed against the floor. Clara's smile vanished. Grandpa, I'm sorry, I got lost. Get out. Okay. Clara nodded meekly and retreated. Standing in the hallway, she bit her lip. Where was George? She had to ask Adrian. Whether or not George was her biological grandfather, he had raised her for 20 years, and that bond was as real as any blood tie. She turned, startled to find Adrian standing silently behind her. She swallowed. You know where my grandpa is, don't you? Adrian's gaze was unreadable. Please, he's all I have left. Tell me, Clara pleaded. Why did you run away? Adrian asked. Clara froze. Adrian, you're back? A man's voice called from downstairs. Yes, Uncle Charles, a servant replied. Adrian glanced at Clara, then strode past her, his voice cool. Uncle. Clara snapped out of her daze and followed. Charles Sterling looked at them, a knowing smile on his face. So, this is the runaway bride? Adrian put his arm around Clara, his voice softening. This is my uncle, Charles. Call him uncle. Uncle Charles, Clara murmured. Charles chuckled. Well, I wasn't expecting my niece-in-law. I didn't bring a red envelope. Adrian's smile remained fixed. You can give it to her later. Charles blinked, then burst out laughing. Uncle Charles, are you here to see grandfather? Adrian and Clara sat on the sofa. Your grandfather asked me to investigate, Charles began, but Adrian interrupted, grandfather is upstairs. Charles paused, glancing at Clara. Right. I'll go up then. He rose and headed upstairs. On the ride back to the apartment, Clara remained silent. Only when the car stopped did she speak. Mr. Sterling, why did you marry me? Because I'm an Evelyn? Was there a previous arrangement? What's the history between the Evelyns and the Sterlings? And where is my grandfather? Clara poured out her questions. Silence filled the car. Adrian stared straight ahead, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. Why did you run away? Clara faltered. He'd asked this before at the estate, only to be interrupted by his uncle. Now, he asked again. Adrian turned his head, his gaze intense. Clara felt a flutter of panic. She bit her lip, her heart racing. Just as she was about to speak, Adrian's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the air. Tell me the truth. Because, the news said, you were gay, she whispered. Adrian scoffed and got out of the car. Panicked, Clara followed him inside. He went into the study, she went to the bedroom. It dawned on her then that he hadn't answered a single question. She was leaning against the headboard, lost in thought, when she heard his voice. Where? Then, I'll be right there. Clara jumped out of bed, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, quickly replaced by determination. She slipped out of the room. Adrian seemed in a hurry, leaving the apartment building in a rush. Their apartment was in the heart of the city. Even though it was past 11, taxis still cruised the streets. Clara hailed one. Driver, follow that car. The one with 4 9s on the license plate? The driver asked. Yes, that one. Stay close, Clara urged. You got it. The taxi accelerated. They weaved through traffic, following the taillights of Adrian's car. It seemed to be going faster and faster. Driver, can you go any faster? Clara asked anxiously. I'm pushing it, miss, the driver replied. Clara sank back in her seat, her heart heavy. Adrian's car disappeared from sight. Still want me to follow? The driver asked. Clara looked out the window, shaking her head. No, turn back. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror and turned the car around. Clara was so consumed with thoughts of Adrian, wondering where he was going and who he was meeting, could it be George? That she didn't notice the route home was wrong. The car stopped. Clara looked up. They were in front of a dilapidated, abandoned building. Panic flared. Why are we here? Your husband doesn't want you anymore. I do. The driver's face twisted into a leer. Don't you dare. I'll call the police. Clara grabbed her phone. The driver lunged, snatching the phone and throwing it out the window. Don't bother. Let me go. Clara struggled. Your husband's done with you. You might as well be with me. He dragged her out of the car towards the building. Get off me. Clara pushed and fought, but he held her tight. You're hurting me. Clara abruptly changed tactics, realizing resistance was making it worse. The driver, momentarily thrown, loosened his grip. That's better. Clara followed him into the derelict building. Broken bricks and wood littered the floor. Suddenly, he turned and lunged at her. With a quick roll, Clara dodged him. You think you can escape? He roared, his face contorted with rage. Clara's hand brushed against a piece of wood. She grabbed it and swung, hitting him hard across the head. A scream echoed through the building. Clara scrambled to her feet and ran. Who's there? A cold voice sliced through the night. Clara froze, clamping a hand over her mouth, hiding in the shadows. Footsteps echoed, drawing closer, stopping beside the unconscious driver. Who sent you? The voice demanded. Clara's blood ran cold. An accomplice. She was trapped. She pressed her hand tighter against her mouth, backing away slowly. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. She screamed. "What are you doing here?" Adrian's voice, tight with displeasure. The scream died in her throat. She opened her eyes. Adrian stood there, his face impassive. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Adrian stiffened, then looked down at the trembling form in his embrace. After a while, he gently pushed her away. "Finished?" Clara hiccuped, wiping her tears. "I was terrified. Couldn't you at least comfort me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. She looked up at him, mortified. Adrian's gaze was inscrutable. "Comfort you?" A hint of amusement touched his lips. Clara's cheeks burned. She looked down, ashamed. "Mr. Sterling, the driver is a known thug. He lures women here under the guise of being a taxi driver." Henry Carter approached, his voice brisk. Adrian frowned and walked outside. Clara looked at Henry, who nodded. "Madam." "Hello," she mumbled, flustered. "Madam, we should go," Henry prompted. Clara turned to look at the driver, still lying motionless on the floor. Is he? She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Henry understood. "No, he's just unconscious from the pain." "Oh." Clara's eyes widened. "Unconscious?" "Mr. Sterling is waiting," Henry reminded her gently. Clara nodded and followed Adrian. In the car, exhaustion washed over her. She leaned against the window, staring out at the city lights. "You followed me?" Adrian's voice broke the silence. Clara turned, their eyes met, and she quickly looked away. She hesitated. I just wanted to know about my grandfather." "So do I." Clara stared at him, surprised. "You don't know? You don't believe me?" Adrian frowned. I don't know." To her, he was still a stranger, despite the past month. She was grateful to him, twice now he'd saved her, but his attitude was a puzzle. Who was he? What did he know? "Your grandfather asked me to marry you. He entrusted your future to me," Adrian said. "Why would you listen to him?" Clara asked. "You're an Evelyn." "I had a prior engagement to an Evelyn," Adrian said simply. "That's it?" Clara asked, incredulous. "Yes." "Weren't you afraid I'd be ugly? Or have bad habits?" Adrian glanced at her, his expression neutral. "You're not conventionally attractive, and you do seem to attract trouble." Clara stared at him for 3 seconds. "You're the trouble." Adrian raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his voice. "There's the real Clara." Clara was speechless. She'd been trying so hard to be the meek, obedient wife, hoping to lower his guard and find out about George. "You don't have to pretend. We're married. We're in this for the long haul." He closed his eyes, looking tired. Clara turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Who wanted to be in this for the long haul? Once she found George, she was leaving. "Did your grandfather ever tell you any secrets?" Adrian's voice broke through her thoughts. "Secrets?" Clara turned back, her eyes questioning. Adrian opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "Secrets between you two. Things no one else would know. Did he give you anything special?" Clara paused, her mind racing. After a long moment, she shook her head. "I don't think so." Adrian frowned. "Don't rush it. Think carefully. Sometimes we overlook the smallest details." Clara bit her lip, thinking hard. "Go home. I have things to take care of." His voice softened. Clara looked out the window. They were back at the apartment. She looked at Adrian, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "When will you be back?" Adrian paused, his gaze lingering on her face. Are you worried about me? Clara blushed. The apartment is big. I'm a little scared being alone. Go on up. Clara hesitated, then opened the car door and got out. Sir, the driver was acting on instructions from Mr. Charles Sterling's assistant, Henry Carter said, looking at Adrian through the rearview mirror. Adrian rubbed his temples, his eyes cold. Drive back to the office. I want to see Simon. Yes, sir. At the top of the Sterling Zenith Tower, Adrian stood by the window, overlooking the city. Adrian, I fear George Ray is no longer with us, Simon said, standing beside him. Adrian turned, a cold smile playing on his lips. With or without him, the end result will be the same. Mutually assured destruction. Simon stared at him. You're insane. Insane? I went insane when my parents, my grandparents, and my uncle were murdered. Adrian's voice was devoid of emotion. Simon fell silent. After a while, he spoke again. What about Clara? Her mother entrusted her to you. You promised to take care of her. 20 years ago, on Adrian's 8th birthday, he had been celebrating with his family on a yacht. Pirates had attacked. Clara's parents had been on board too. In their final moments, they'd hidden him and baby Clara in a secret compartment. He'd huddled there, eyes squeezed shut, listening to the chaos until the pirates were gone. His grandfather had brought him back to the States, and he'd rebuilt his life. But baby Clara had vanished. Guilt and a sense of responsibility had haunted him. He often thought of the tiny infant who had shared that terrifying experience with him. As he grew older, questions gnawed at him. He began digging for answers. The truth, when it came, was more horrifying than he could have imagined. The mastermind behind the attack was his father's half-brother, his own uncle, Charles. George Ray had been the leader of the pirates. Perhaps his conscience had finally gotten the better of him. When he learned that Charles intended to harm the infant Clara, he'd taken her and raised her as his own. Adrian had only narrowly escaped Charles's attempts on his own life, thanks to his grandfather's protection. He'd had no intention of marrying Clara. But George Ray had blackmailed him with evidence of Charles's crimes. He'd agreed to the marriage, but he hadn't expected to feel something for her. He'd even scoffed at Simon's suggestion that she might run. I'll leave her everything I own. She'll be taken care of. Adrian lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. She's had a hard life. No parents, and now her grandfather's gone. She's all alone, Simon sighed. Adrian paused, the image of Clara's anxious face flashing through his mind. A small, vulnerable bird caught in a storm. Back at the apartment, Clara sat at her computer, holding a small jade pendant, a birthday gift from George when she was 10. Adrian's words had made her think of it. She traced the smooth surface with her fingers, stopping at a barely noticeable crack. She gently pried it open. Inside was a tiny USB drive. She quickly plugged it into her computer. A password prompt appeared. After a few failed attempts, a thought struck her. She typed in a series of numbers. Success. The password was a combination of her and Adrian's birthdays. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She clicked on the file. Her face drained of color. So that's how it was. It all made sense now. This USB drive, the secrets it contained, was perhaps George's true gift to her. 2 weeks later, in a hospital room, Adrian lay in bed, his left leg and arm encased in casts, a bandage on his forehead. Charles Sterling stood over him, his face cold. Adrian, I'm sparing your life because you're my nephew. Why fight me? Adrian's eyes flickered open, a faint smile playing on his lips. Sparing my life? Uncle, if it wasn't for grandfather, you would have taken it long ago. Charles's face darkened. You're determined to destroy me. Adrian looked away. I call you uncle out of respect for grandfather. But to me, you're nothing but a bastard. You're asking for it, Adrian. Charles exploded. He'd lived his entire life with the stigma of being illegitimate, pleading with his father to legitimize his mother, but the old man had refused, leaving his mother to die with that regret. "Do you know why grandfather never married your mother?" Adrian asked coldly. Charles glared at him. "Grandmother was the love of his life. My father, his favorite son. Your mother was nothing but a substitute." Charles's jaw clenched. "What does it matter? Sterling Zenith will be mine. And you'll be dead soon enough. Don't celebrate too soon, uncle." A faint smile touched Adrian's lips. The door opened, and uniformed officers entered. "Charles Sterling, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to commit murder." Charles stared, dumbfounded. "Impossible. You've made a mistake." His protests were futile. They handcuffed him and led him away. "You can come out now," Adrian said, tapping the side of the bed. Clara crawled out from underneath, brushing herself off, her brow furrowed. "Why did you do that? He's a monster. He deserves to rot in jail. You didn't have to risk your life. Simon didn't have enough evidence." "And with your grandfather gone," Adrian trailed off. "Even so, your life is precious. My mother saved you. You shouldn't throw it away." Clara glared at him. A faint smile touched Adrian's lips. "Then I owe you, Miss Ray, or is it Miss Evelyn? A debt of gratitude." "Call me Mrs. Sterling," she said pointedly. Adrian blinked, then chuckled. "Eager to be my wife, are you?" Clara tilted her head. "Aren't I already?" Adrian's smile faded. "Clara, our marriage was a sham. There's no love between us. You deserve to be free. I'll give you everything I own. Go live your own life." "But your parents and my grandfather wanted us to be together," Clara insisted. "I'll take care of you as a brother. Anything you need, I'll provide." "Anything?" Clara's eyes widened. Adrian nodded. "Then I want to have your baby." Clara looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. Adrian stared at her, speechless. Clara's lips curved into a small smile. Her parents and grandfather had approved of him. She would honor their wishes and become his wife. Adrian closed his eyes, ignoring her. Clara tiptoed to the bed and tucked him in. Then she went to the bathroom, wet a cloth, and came back to gently wipe his face and neck. Adrian finally opened his eyes, exasperated. "You don't need to do this. Go to bed." His voice was husky. "I'm not tired. Go to sleep. I won't bother you." She placed the cloth aside and sat in the chair, her gaze fixed on him. Adrian sighed. Clara's relentless pursuit, her mixture of playful teasing and genuine care, slowly chipped away at Adrian's defenses. He, a man of decisive action in all other matters, found himself hesitant and uncertain when it came to her. One day, Clara arrived at his office, with a lunchbox. "Honey, lunchtime," she chirped. Adrian, engrossed in work, tensed at the sound of her voice. He looked up, meeting her bright smile. "Just leave it there. You can go." "Okay." Clara placed the lunchbox on the coffee table, then glanced at Adrian and gasped, dramatically. Adrian looked up sharply. Clara was clutching her leg, her face contorted in pain. He rushed to her side. "What's wrong?" His voice was laced with concern. The next moment, she was in his arms, clinging to his neck. "You do care." It was a ruse. Adrian shook his head, a fond smile playing on his lips. "You're incorrigible. And you're in denial." "You care, but you're too afraid to admit it," Clara retorted. "Do you really want to be with me?" Adrian asked seriously. Clara nodded without hesitation. "Of course. You're my first crush. My first love." Adrian laughed. He tapped her nose lightly. "Since you're my first love too, I guess I'll have to put up with you." "Are you my first love, too?" Clara's eyes widened. Adrian paused, then whispered in her ear. Yes. Before Clara, his life had been consumed with revenge for his family. Even when he'd felt a flicker of attraction for someone, he'd lacked the courage to pursue it. This woman, who both exasperated and captivated him, had made him rethink everything. He wouldn't burden her with his past any longer. He would choose love. And so, they began a real relationship, navigating the everyday joys and challenges of married life, finding comfort and happiness in each other's company. The end.